Was Trotsky a prophet who predicted the collapse of the USSR? Part 3. In the previous two parts of this work, the main misconceptions of Trotskyism were analyzed, so I recommend that those who have not read them or listen to the audio version for a more complete understanding of this issue. The third part of the article begins with a reference to the first volume of the Lectures on the History of Philosophy by Georg Hegel, in which the great German thinker expresses his attitude to the philosophy of Confucius. We have the discourses of Confucius with his disciples, in which there is nothing remarkable, but only a walking moral in good, practical teachings, which we find everywhere among all peoples and, moreover, even better expressed, Cicero's De Officiis, which is a book of edifying moral sermons, gives us more than all the books of Confucius. The latter is the say preacher of practical wisdom. There is absolutely no speculative philosophy to be found in him, and from his own writings it may be concluded that it would be better for his fame if they were not translated. The works published by the Jesuits are, however, more a paraphrase than a translation. I will not cite here all the already well-known quotes of Confucius, but it is clear from Hegel's statement that he evaluates the philosophy of Confucius as a set of trivial worldly wisdom, while he refers to a possible inaccurate translation. When we look at Trotsky's works, we can say the same thing, except that there is no wisdom in his works and his works cannot have an inaccurate translation, since they were written in Russian. To reject possible speculations on this topic, I will say that this review does not apply to any particular country in the world and is not a separate special case. Analyzing Trotsky's theory of the deformed workers' estate, we will focus specifically on the bureaucracy, which, in his opinion, was the cause of the collapse of the USSR. Just note that the bureaucrat is an employee. He also sells his ability to work in the labor market, as well as any employee. The bureaucracy cannot be considered as a separate and stable caste of people, since within the bureaucracy there is the same class division as in the whole society, and within the bureaucracy there is the same division between rich and poor. And this division exists within the bureaucracy precisely because this division exists in the whole of society, and not because this division exists within the bureaucracy in isolation from the whole of society. While the caste system itself is the result of such a division of the whole society, it is not the result of the division or separation of its individual groups engaged in a particular field of activity separately from the whole society. In other words, castes cannot exist outside of a caste society. A separate caste cannot be embedded in any other non-caste society. What the Trotskyists propose is the equivalent of embedding the Indian medieval priest caste into the modern state apparatus and calling them the bureaucrat caste, and for Trotsky and his followers this is exactly the case. Since they have the illusion that the interest in subordinating the lower bureaucrat to the higher is outside the material sphere, in reality, on the contrary, the interest lies only in it, as well as the interest of all other employees of the whole society. By presenting the bureaucracy as a privileged caste, an unstable caste, and by awarding it other epithets, the Trotskyists do not understand that the interest of a particular caste member also lies in the material sphere, but it is not direct, but it is mediated, since an individual member, by directly protecting the interests of the caste, thus indirectly protects himself. But with the bureaucracy, everything is exactly the opposite, because without having a direct personal benefit for himself, no bureaucrat will protect the interests of the bureaucracy. That is, a bureaucrat will not protect the interests of the bureaucracy in general, without initially having a personal benefit for himself. That is why the material interest of the bureaucracy is immediate. And this spontaneity does not lead the bureaucrat beyond the interests of the employee. Like any employee, the bureaucrat is primarily interested in selling his work at the highest possible price. That is why it is impossible to dispute the existence of truly honest and incorruptible bureaucrats. You can only dispute their number. It is impossible to attribute only to the bureaucracy the desire to do less, but to get more, since this is characteristic of all employees. If absolutely all bureaucrats were not employees, then such a state would not be able to exist, since the activity of the bureaucratic apparatus of such a state would be impossible due to the observance of the bureaucracy only of its own personal interests. Being in the highest position with a very large salary, having firms registered to relatives, through which he takes money into his pocket, the bureaucrat will remain primarily an employee. But if he is particularly zealous in finding material benefits, he may be punished. Therefore, the state cannot exist without punishing particularly zealous bureaucrats. The bureaucracy is not a ruling class, a separate caste, a class, and at the same time not a class, a group with narrow interests, etc. The bureaucracy is only an instrument of the rule of the ruling class. From the most primitive forms of Bonapartism, when it seems that capital is not separable from bureaucracy, to the most modern forms, when it seems, on the contrary, that capital is separable from bureaucracy, bureaucracy is not equal to capital, but it is subordinate to it. That is why in underdeveloped capitalist countries, officials live in luxurious palaces under guard, African countries, while in developed capitalist countries, senior officials and heads of state can be found buying food in an ordinary store without protection, Western Europe, the United States. As the progress of modern industry developed, expanded, and deepened the class opposition between capital and labor, state power assumed more and more the character of the national power of capital over labor, of a social force organized for social enslavement, of a machine of class domination. Karl Marx, Complete Works 4, Volume 17. Pages 339-340. 2 points should be noted. First, the bureaucracy is an instrument of the domination of both the bourgeois class and the working class, if it comes to power. Second, the ruling class optimizes the bureaucracy to suit its needs. One of the most fundamental dogmas of Trotskyism is based on the rejection of bureaucracy, and no Trotskyist will say how it is possible to build a state apparatus without bureaucracy, how a state can exist without officials. And this is a clear example of their disdain for dialectics. Well, the answer is quite simple. The state cannot exist without bureaucracy, just as it cannot exist without the exploitation of labor in one way or another. No matter how much the Trotskyists chatter, jump ship, or elect bureaucrats from among the workers and with the help of the workers, the bureaucracy will not disappear from this, but will absorb the workers who were elected to its ranks yesterday. The ruling class can only optimize the bureaucracy, increase or reduce it quantitatively, but it cannot completely abandon it. Therefore, in the first phase of communism, under socialism, the bureaucracy will also be preserved, even in a reduced and limited form, without which the existence of the state is impossible. The bureaucracy will disappear completely only in the second phase of communist society, along with the death of the state itself. All criticism of the bureaucracy on the part of the Trotskyists is the usual populism, designed to attract the attention of the broad masses. This concludes the third part of the article, which is devoted to a critical analysis of the provisions of Trotskyism. P. Ravidin.